After a couple years of the absolute abuses of government harassing good people out of business and separating families from life's most important moments of weddings, funerals, births, and more, socially stunting kids and conditioning them to believe that their lives are under constant threat unless they wear a security blanket over their faces, among other betrayals of the rights of the people to which these government agents ostensibly swear an oath, there is rarely an apology, let alone any corrective justice, to be found. And of course, just a little honesty in retrospect would be the least these people could offer did we actually gain anything by the silly, arbitrary power grab of locking everybody down and masking everybody up. All available evidence says no, because for all the many powers of the science, the one thing it can't do is demonstrate that lockdown measures produced any viral transmission mitigation. Same for masks. The best they can offer is maybe. We can't say conclusively that it didn't help. Yeah, well, we also can't say that doing the hokey pokey and turning yourself around didn't scare away the virus either, or sticking a thumb up your ass for that matter. The point is that without affirmative evidence that these things did help, the presumption is they did not. That is the way the science actually works. And the evidence we do have indicates significant harm, actually. Academic performance among students has suffered dramatically. Inflation has reduced everyone's wealth and buying power. The artificial axing of foot traffic killed our small businesses in the hundreds of thousands, artificially boosting the largest corporations that could withstand such losses and, of course, often enjoyed the benefit of being arbitrarily labeled essential in their business anyhow. After all of that nonsense, it is nice to see at least one little guy, or a small group of little guys in this case, get one little win to bring about some justice for that abuse. And don't get me wrong, I understand this is a little like the dog celebrating a bone to chew on while his masters eat the steak, but the point in that metaphor is that the dog does still have the teeth in that relationship, an important fact for the dog to remember. You may recall this particular episode of lockdown and mask nonsense in September 2020. In Moscow, Idaho, members of the town's Christ Church gathered in the parking lot outside City Hall to protest the mayor's mask and social distancing order. They sang psalms unmasked in defiance, and they ignored the designated socially distanced protest spots painted on the blacktop. One of the attending church members told the local paper, "We are here because we are frankly fed up with wearing masks. With 400 cases and 0 hospitalizations, this is not an emergency. When we hear mandatory masks, it's a good time to stand up because what's next? Forced vaccinations? What a kooky prediction. What loony nonsense," their critics at the time said before it was fully realized within the next year. Once again, the crazy paranoid people we were told to ignore were absolutely right. The city of Moscow deployed 10 police officers to handle this unmasked, socially undistanced, Christ-worshipping revolt of the peasants. It appears just making their picks arbitrarily from the crowd, asking people to provide ID so police could issue citations for defying the public health order. One young married couple, Sean and Rachel Bonnet, refused to identify themselves to surrender to that health order citation, and for that, police pulled them aside, and because they refused to provide ID, police arrested them in the most impossibly wholesome arrest scene of all time.
We respectfully and honorably will not. Yeah, I think it's the right thing.
As part of what we're supposed to believe was resisting and obstructing officers, what would become their charge, Sean and Rachel asked if it's okay if they keep singing while police work out their arrest logistics.
Is it okay for us to sing until
You can sing, but you need to stand right there.
Okay. Is it okay? I mean, I'm gonna put my hands on this if this go bad.
I don't want to risk you guys.
I don't want to.
Really honest.
Yeah, I know.
The police didn't want to arrest them for such silliness, and yet they did anyway. I understand that every job has aspects of it that are undesirable. Every job requires you to perform tasks you'd otherwise prefer not to, but you do it anyway because you value the dollar that you earn more than you dislike the unpleasantries. And in many cases, that makes sense. I would clean toilets to provide for my family if I had to, for example. I think most husbands and fathers would, because my family's welfare is more important than my personal comfort in avoiding that mess. But there are still things you wouldn't do for money, though. I wouldn't become a hitman to provide for my family, for example. I wouldn't sell my wife into prostitution to provide for my family. And it's not to say that these crimes are exactly the same necessarily, but for the same reason, I wouldn't arbitrarily arrest my neighbors to provide for my family either, because there are fundamental moral truths about not abusing others that are more important than just my paycheck alone. So when this officer says, "I don't want to arrest you," the asterisk is, "but I will, because I value my paycheck more than I do your rights or my oath." He had a choice to make, and he made it, and that choice was, I would abuse you to provide for my family, actually. For that betrayal, the only people deserving arrest that day were these cops, but you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the implication of the city's own response and actions. A few months after the arrest in January 2021, the city dropped the charges against the Bonnets after challenge from their lawyers on First Amendment grounds, the city agreeing that the health order did not say that constitutionally protected speech and assembly were limited or prohibited. And that was supposed to be the end of it, the city apparently thinking that if they just wiped their hands of it, these very polite pushovers would accept simply being left alone after this abuse as adequate. And that calculation may have been close to correct, but it lacked one key ingredient: an apology. Another man arrested that day said city officials refused to meet with him for even a good faith discussion. So there was no apology, and Sean and Rachel say the same thing. A lot can be forgiven, but you gotta say sorry first.
There's been no sense of forgiveness or seeking to make wrongs right. No one has tried to apologize or admit any wrong.
Because sorry, of course, means an acknowledgement of the wrongdoing rather than a cover-up. Conversely, not saying sorry means ignoring the principle of the matter. During the arrest, the very unwilling police officer who still did it said, "Yeah, well, these are very unusual times."
It's an unusual time.
But of course, that's the thing about the principles of right and wrong. They are constantly true. They don't bend to the times. We don't test commitment to principle by application when it's easy. We test it by application when it's hard.
Holding the line begins with having a clear set of principles and convictions. So if you are kind of in your mind, you don't have a clear picture of what's right, what's wrong, what you should and shouldn't be doing, it's going to be hard to act in those pressure moments. When you're in a place where you're taught about what is right and what you should be doing in whatever circumstance, big or small, and then when you're surrounded by a good community that'll support you, it kind of makes it easy.
So without the city willing to meet on those points in good faith, Sean and Rachel were left without the justice that they sought.
If people do something wrong, there needs to be, especially nowadays, when you feel like you're fighting for every inch of justice and sanity in our society and culture, we want to make sure that we let people know that justice and righteousness will win at the end of the day. And so sometimes that means a civil lawsuit.
And so they did. 2 months after the city dropped the charges without apology, Sean and Rachel filed a civil lawsuit in federal court in Idaho alleging violations of their First Amendment rights. The city initially tried to get the suit dismissed, but the judge refused, and rather than fight it, perhaps in another gesture of acknowledgement that their actions were legally, if not morally wrong, on the 14th of this month, the city agreed to settle the dispute for $300,000. though as a technical matter, the city admits no fault and still emphasizes the unprecedented nature of the pandemic and the city's efforts to protect the public during an exceptionally trying time. Who exactly was protected by this unprecedented gesture is, of course, a hypothetical that remains open for your speculation. Presumably, this unprecedented gesture had unprecedented beneficiaries too, but apparently the Bigfoot and unicorn who benefited could not be reached for comment. The only conclusive demonstration that we have is not one of service, actually. It's one of abuse, hence the settlement. And of course, while it is nice to see decent people compensated for that abuse, it is also important to remember who bears the burden for that compensation, because while the abuse came from the mayor and the city council and the police force at their direction, it isn't them who pays for it. It's you, or at least it's the citizens of Moscow from whom the city extracts its money. As the other man arrested in this case says in response, the city does not care about the people or justice or the money. Their insurance premiums go up because of their irresponsibility. Who cares? They just send you the bill. So the government created the problem in the form of arbitrary, silly rules enforced selectively in a drastically disproportionate response to a virus that was a statistical zero risk to everybody involved that day. And now, to correct for that abuse, the government will collect from these same citizens to hand their money right back to them. It's like stealing from the register to buy a candy bar at the grocery store. It's not an honest transaction. Government created the problem by burdening you. Government then solves the problem by burdening you further. So it naturally follows then that to limit the government is to limit these burdens, hence the importance of maintaining the principles that Sean and Rachel are talking about. To the extent the city is now paying, that's an admission that it would have been better for the city to do absolutely nothing at all. Now, the city wants you to believe this is some anomaly, an example of extraordinary measures taken in extraordinary times, but is it? Or is it actually routine? Extrapolate the logic outward and see how familiar it sounds. Is it really likely that these politicians and bureaucrats actually are some sort of heroic line between you and certain death, or is it more likely that they just need you to think that, so you surrender power and resources to them? Are they really solving problems, or are they just creating them in the first place and then sending you the bill? Are these people who truly operate with your consent and your rights as the priority? If so, why is it impossible for them to apologize when they've betrayed those first principles? And is it any coincidence that they treat worshiping another god with such hostility? If they can break your commitment to moral principles otherwise, they can lead you astray into the nonsense world where whatever silliness they impose today is automatically legitimate, because after all, the only principle that matters is their authority. There is no right and wrong. There is only what they say. So we should take our pick and choose wisely. Do we want to risk it with the singing church people who might incidentally expose us to the occasional droplet, but have a clear moral conscience against much more severe intentional abuses? Or do we want to go with the suits who say shut the hell up and do what we say, because we know your own good much better than you do? Of course, the pandemic is now officially over as a legal matter, and so it's tempting to think that philosophical matter is now expired too, but it isn't. In fact, that same question appears in modified or disguised forms almost every single day, actually. Are we going to maintain the truth that the concepts of right and wrong were here long before any government was, or are we going to surrender to the ruse that government holds the exclusive right to set those terms itself? That is not a question relevant only to some obscure years-old prayer sing-along in Idaho. That is the question on which our entire country is founded, after all. There are self-evident moral truths that pre-exist government, and upon which all legitimate government is built. That's the idea. That's why we have the country that we do, or did. depending on your level of cynicism. But if our understanding of that timeless truth gets distorted into momentary whim, into, well, it kind of depends how unprecedented the times are actually, get ready for much more cynicism about much more significant costs to pay. In that case, the $300,000 in Idaho will look like a major bargain in retrospect. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel always. Appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.